mystery too disturbing to become a Netflix documentary. Not because it wasn't fascinating enough, but because no one can prove where the evidence really leads. It begins with governments, and it ends beneath your feet. For 70 years, they told us the same thing. There's nothing in the sky, nothing we can't explain. Go home, go to sleep, and then, quietly, one country at a time, they started to change their story. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is where the trail leads once you start to follow it. Because for as long as we have wondered whether we are alone, we have always looked in one direction. We have looked up, at the stars, at the cold black spaces between them. We were certain that if anyone was out there, they would be out there, far away, somewhere we could never reach. Tonight, I want you to consider something else, just for a little while. Here, in the dark, where it's safe, I want you to consider that we have been looking in the wrong way this entire time. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. There's nothing you need to do tonight, nothing you need to solve. Just follow me down, and remember, that's the direction the story is going. Down. Keep it in your mind, you'll understand why later. Let's begin with the part we can prove. Far to the south, there's a country pressed thin between the mountains and the sea. Chile. A long ribbon of land, where the air is clear and the sky goes on forever. And Chile did something the rest of the world found almost embarrassing. In 1997, they made it official. They created a committee, a real one, with a long, serious name, and real officers and air traffic controllers whose entire job was to collect reports of things in the sky that should not be there. Not to laugh at them, to study them. And for years, that committee quietly filed sighting after sighting into folders that almost no one ever read. Ordinary reports, lights, shapes, things pilots saw and couldn't name. Until one afternoon in 2014. Now here's the detail that most people rush past. So slow down with me. A Chilean Navy helicopter was flying a routine patrol along the coast, near the capital. 2 experienced crewmen aboard. Nothing unusual about the day at all. And then ahead of them, at about 4,500 feet, they noticed something. An object, warm against the cold sky, and behind it trailed a kind of plume. A discharge, like a small comet that had decided, for reasons of its own, to fly perfectly level. They turned their camera on it. And you might think, alright, another blurry light, another smear on a lens. But what the camera recorded wasn't the disturbing part. They filmed it for 9 minutes. 9 full minutes. Not a flash. Not a dot. Something you could watch and rewind and watch again. Clear enough to study frame by frame. And that is exactly what they did. The Chilean military took that footage and handed it to their scientists, their aviation experts, their weather specialists, everyone whose job it is to look at something strange and say, calmly, oh, that's just a plane. That's a weather balloon. That's a reflection off the sea. And here's where it gets unsettling, because the disturbing part didn't come that afternoon in the helicopter. The disturbing part came 2 years later. They studied that footage for 2 full years. And at the end of it, this room full of trained, skeptical, careful professionals reached the one conclusion no one wants to reach. They didn't know what it was. They couldn't identify it. They couldn't explain it. And to their great credit, they didn't pretend to. They simply closed the file and admitted something was up there, and it did not belong to us. But Chile was open. Chile almost expected strange skies, in the old stories of the people who lived in those mountains long before the cities came. There are beings of light who descended from above. It's woven into who they are. So when said we don't know. It barely made a ripple. The truly strange shift came from the last country on Earth you would ever expect. A country that had spent a lifetime saying no. Remember this next part, because it's the moment the silence started to crack. Japan. For as long as anyone could remember, the men at the very top of Japan's defense establishment had exactly one answer to this whole subject. Not skepticism, something colder than that. Complete disinterest, as though the question itself were beneath them. And in 2018, they made it as clear as language allows. An official statement. We do not recognize the existence of these objects, not in our airspace, not anywhere. Which was a very firm thing to announce about something that supposedly didn't exist. Because here's the detail almost everyone misses. At the very same time, their government was denying everything. Their own pilots were talking, quietly, among themselves, never in public, never on the record. There was a wing commander, a career military man, decades in uniform, and he spent years listening to these conversations in break rooms and hangars and quiet corners of air bases. Pilots who had seen things while training high above the ocean. Civilians who had called them in from the ground, and he came to believe privately that someone should be writing all of it down, organizing it, treating it seriously, treating it as data. But it was never reported. It was passed between men like a secret, traded carefully, only with the ones you trusted not to laugh at you, and some of those secrets were not small at all. Don't forget this one. It matters more than it seems. There was a young pilot, a student, still learning to fly a fighter jet, and he was in the air, running through his training when the aircraft began to fight him. The controls stopped answering. The alarm sounded. Something was wrong with the machine, and he couldn't tell what. And as he wrestled with it, fighting to keep the jet level, he looked out through the canopy, and he saw it. A long object, shaped like a cigar, high above him, moving from one horizon to the other, east to west, smooth and effortless, as though the laws that were about to kill him simply did not apply to it. Then it was gone, and so was whatever had been wrong with his aircraft. Now hold that image, and here's why it matters. For years, the order to pilots like him was always the same. Say nothing. Keep it in the break room. Keep it off the record. Protect your career. And then, in a single month in the year 2020, the decades-long silence broke. The defense minister of Japan stood up and did the exact opposite of everything his country had ever done. He instructed the self-defense forces that if they ever encountered something in the sky they could not explain, they were to film it, to document it, to make it real. And that raises a question that should keep you here with me. What changes a nation's mind like that? What makes the most skeptical government on Earth turn completely around? In a single month, the answer was a meeting just weeks before that order. Japan's defense minister had sat down privately with his American counterpart, and when the two of them walked out, they said something extraordinary out loud. They had discussed these unidentified objects, and they had agreed to cooperate, to share what they knew. Two of the most powerful, most cautious, most tight-lipped militaries on the planet, quietly agreeing to compare notes on something they had both spent their careers denying. You do not build a task force to study nothing. You do not shatter 70 years of silence over an empty sky. So the real question was never, are they there? The governments answered that one for us, in their own careful way, simply by changing their behavior. The real question single blinding instant. And in that same strange year, one of America's greatest explorers ascended a fleet. His name is Admiral Richard Byrd, and he is a legend, one of the first men in history to fly over both the North and the South Poles. And now he is given command of the largest expedition ever sent to the bottom of the world, Antarctica. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, nearly 5,000 men. This part is history. It's real. It even has a name, Operation Highjump, and its stated goals were ordinary enough: map the ice, scout locations for possible bases, test men and machines against the cruelest cold on Earth. The expedition was meant to last 4 months. It ended in less than 2, and why it ended so early is where history stops and legend begins. Now, I have to be honest with you here, in the quiet, because this is the kind of story that only works if we're honest about exactly what it is. There's a diary. It's said to have belonged to Admiral Byrd himself, said to have been found by his son after the Admiral was gone, said to contain the things he was ordered, for the rest of his life, never to say out loud. And I have to tell you plainly, before I read you a word of it, no one has ever verified this diary. Many serious researchers believe it was written by someone else entirely, long after Byrd had died. It has no clear origin. It may be a beautiful, elaborate invention, but I'm going to tell you what it says anyway, because whether it is true or not, it is one of the most haunting things ever attributed to a man who really did fly to the bottom of the world. Most people stop paying attention right about here, and they miss the strangest clue in the entire story. The diary claims that as Byrd flew out over the pole, the world beneath him began to change. The endless, blinding white gave way to something that had no business existing. Warmth, color, green. A landscape hidden under all that ice. Rivers, forests, and a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, with no sun in the sky to make it. And then, the diary says, his controls were no longer his. Discs, shining circular craft rising up out of nowhere to surround his plane, not attacking, guiding, steering him downward, gently, the way you would steer a lost child by the shoulders. They brought him to the ground, and there, in a vast chamber deep inside the earth, he was met by a being he called only the Master. And here's the detail that changes everything. The Master was not curious about the surface world. He was not fascinated by us. He was disappointed in us. He spoke about the weapon, the bombs, the 2 cities that had vanished in a flash of light. He said, in effect, that they had been watching, and that what humanity was becoming frightened them. Not only for humanity's sake, but because this world, he said, was their world too. And then Byrd was sent home, and told, the story goes, never to speak of it again, escorted somewhere quiet, informed that everything he had seen now belonged to other men, in other rooms, who would decide what the world was allowed to know. Now, said the diary aside, remember, we cannot prove a single word of it, but hold on to one detail, just one. The disappointment, the bombs, because that detail does not stay buried in an unverified diary. It comes back, somewhere much, much harder to dismiss. And that's the part I want you to hear next. Ask the men who guarded America's nuclear missiles. Not conspiracy theorists, not dreamers. Officers, Air Force personnel who sat through long freezing nights deep underground beside the most destructive machines ever built by human hands, men whose entire purpose was to be reliable, unshakable, beyond exaggeration. The kind of men chosen precisely because they do not imagine things. And some of them have described the same event. A craft, hovering above the silo, sitting silently over the very weapons they were sworn to protect with their lives. And while it hovered missiles went offline, disarmed, made safe, shut down, as though something had reached down through steel and concrete and quietly switched off humanity's ability to end itself. Not to threaten, to demonstrate, to prove without a single word that it could. Now line those two things up beside each other in the dark. A being beneath the ice, disappointed in our palms, and officers underground watching their weapons go cold beneath a light in the sky. Two completely different stories. Two completely different kinds of witness. And the same fear underneath both of them. You're going to hurt yourselves, and you may hurt this world in the process. And this world is not only yours, and that raises a possibility that should feel comforting. But somehow, it doesn't. What if the Watchers were never strangers passing through it all? What if they live here? Keep that question with you, because now I'm going to take you to a forest, and in that forest, everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. Because if the diary is a story we can't trust, what happened in Rendlesham is not. It's documented. It's dated. And the men at the very center of it are still alive today, still named and still trying to understand what happened to them all those years ago. Suffolk, the east coast of England, a cold, damp corner of the country where the mist rolls in off the sea and settles low between the pine trees. Just outside a quiet village called Rendlesham sits a military base, and at the time it was being used by the American Air Force. The date is the 26th of December, 1980, the day after Christmas, the sleepiest, stillest, most ordinary night of the entire year. Remember that, because nothing about this night stayed ordinary for very long. An airman named John Burroughs is doing a routine security check when the call comes crackling over his radio. His supervisor wants him. Something's wrong out by the east gate, and as they look together toward the tree line, they see lights. Not headlights, not the base. Multiple colors. Shifting. Moving among the trunks, deep in the forest, where absolutely nothing should be moving at all. They call it in. More men are sent down to look, and as the small group walks slowly toward those impossible lights, the air begins to change. That's the part every one of them describes. The air itself. It felt charged, electric. Their skin began to prickle. The hair on their arms slowly stood up on its own, and the closer they crept toward those lights among the trees, the stronger the feeling became, until it wasn't just their skin anymore. Time itself seemed to thicken. One of the men, a sergeant, James Peniston, he later said that everything around him began to move as though through water. Slow, heavy, wrong, as if the night itself had turned to syrup and he was wading through it, and through that thick electric slowness, he saw it clearly. A craft. Just beyond the trees, triangular, perhaps 6 or 7 feet high. Black, but not the black of a shadow. The black of something that is truly, physically there. Now I remember his name, James Peniston, because what he does next is the reason this story is never ever closed. He walked around it, slowly, circling this impossible thing in the freezing mist, and on its surface he found markings, symbols. He had gone out into that forest expecting a crash prototype, something with familiar stamps and serial numbers. United States Air Force. Something that belonged to the world he understood. Instead, he found glyphs, pictures, a written language he had never seen in pressed his hand against the surface of the craft. Now, what he says happened in that moment, I have to give you as his account, his experience, not as proven fact, but also not the kind of thing a disciplined military man tends to invent about himself. He said that the instant his hand met the surface, something poured into him. Information. A flood of it. Like a picture being held up directly in front of his mind. And within that picture, over and over, a single pattern. Ones. And zeros. He didn't understand it. He couldn't have, but he could not shake it either. And the very next day, compelled, almost against his own will, he began to write it down, page after page, ones and zeros, binary, the silent language of machines. And here is the detail that left investigators speechless. For years, it sat there, a meaningless string of digits scrawled by a shaken man who couldn't explain why he'd written them, until, much later, someone finally fed those pages into a computer and ran them through a program built to translate binary into words. And words came out. I'm not going to dress them up for you. I'll give them to you exactly the way they emerge from that machine, and you can decide, here in the dark, what they mean. The message spoke of an exploration of humanity. Something ongoing. Something continuous. Carried out, it said, for the sake of planetary advance, and then it named an origin. It spoke of a beginning. A place these things had come from. Origin year. 8100. Sit with that for a moment. Read it again in your mind. Not a distant planet. Not a star with a number. A year. A year that has not happened yet. And suddenly the entire shape of the mystery bends. Because if that message is real, if it means what it appears to me, then the craft in that misty English forest did not cross the cold emptiness of space to reach two frightened airmen on the day after Christmas. It crossed time. Now. I promised you honesty, and here it is. The binary translation is disputed. Skeptics rightly point out that you can find patterns in almost anything if you want to find them badly enough, and that a man who touched a mysterious craft and then wrote down a code he says appeared inside his mind is not a scientific instrument. All of that is fair. Every word of it. But here is what skepticism cannot so easily wave away. Both the men, Peniston and Burroughs, both of them carried something out of that forest that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And it wasn't just a memory. It was physical. Burroughs began to have problems. With his throat, with his eyes. At one point his gums turned white. His vision started to fail him. And when he finally went to see a doctor, one of the very first questions the doctor asked him, before Burroughs had explained a single thing, before he'd said one word about a forest, or a craft, or a light, the doctor asked him whether he had ever been exposed to radiation. Let that land for a moment. And then, there were the dreams. Years later, long after he left the service and tried to move on with an ordinary life, John Burroughs began to dream. Night after night. Vivid. Insistent. The same shape returning to him again and again in the dark. And he said that in those dreams, he finally understood what the craft had been. That the beings inside it were not from another world at all. They were travelers from tens of thousands of years in our own future. And they had come back, not to observe us, not to harvest us, not to conquer anything. They had come back to fix something, to correct a mistake that hadn't been made yet, a catastrophe waiting somewhere far down the line, something so terrible the only way to prevent it was to reach back through time itself and change the past. To change us. Before we became whatever it was they were so afraid of. You never once felt they were alien. Not for a single moment. You always felt they were us. So sit with that, here in the quiet. We began this night looking up at the stars, a distant, cold, unreachable worlds. And here, in a wet forest in England, the trail turns again, and it whispers something new. Maybe they were never far away at all. Maybe the distance was never measured in miles. Maybe it was measured in years. But there's still one more direction we haven't looked. And it's the oldest one of all. Because if we're going to take seriously the idea that they were here all along, then we have to go into the grind. There's another version of this mystery. Older than airmen, older than admirals, told not in break rooms and military files, but by farmers and cave explorers, and by some of the oldest stories our species has ever told. And it begins with a place that is absolutely, unarguably real. In 1991, a man in the deep jungles of central Vietnam stumbled onto a hole in a mountainside. The cliffs leading down into it were so steep, so slick with jungle damp, that he could not bring himself to enter. So he simply noted where it was, and he walked away. And here's the strange thing. It took nearly 20 years for anyone to go back and properly explore it. And what they found down there rewrote the record books of the entire world. It's called Sondo, and it is the largest cave chamber on the face of the planet. Now, don't picture a tunnel. Don't picture a cramped little cavern. Picture a world. In places, the ceiling soars 40 stories above your head. There's a river running through it. Not a trickle, not a puddle. An actual river with its own current, deep inside the mountain, and where the roof collapsed in some ancient age long before history. Sunlight now pours down in vast columns of light, and in that light, buried inside solid rock, an entire forest grows. Real trees, real vegetation, its own weather, its own clouds, its own complete ecosystem, sailed away from the surface of the earth for millions of years. An underground world, older than mankind, with its own light and its own life. All of that is true. You can find the photographs, you can watch the footage, none of it is in question. And it's exactly here that the mystery slips in through the side door, the way it always seems to, because the people who have lived near Suntung for generations tell a story about that cave. And I need to be very clear with you now. This part is legend, folklore, not a thing anyone has ever photographed, or captured, or proven. They say that something lives in the deep of the cave, not animals as we know them. They describe figures, upright, shaped something like a person, but not a person. Reptilian, beings that emerge from the black heart of the cave, and then withdraw again, back down into darkness that no explorer has ever reached the bottom of. And you might dismiss that as one village's ghost story. One old superstition, passed down to frighten children. Except that it isn't only one village, on the complete opposite side of the planet, high in the mountains of Peru, near Cusco, the ancient stone heart of the Inca. There are the same kinds of stories, tunnels beneath the earth, a serpent people, and doorways into the ground that, according to local history, the authorities themselves eventually decided were far too dangerous to leave open. So they found them, every entrance they could, and they sealed them shut. Reptilian figures beneath a mountain in Vietnam, serpent beings beneath the mountain sealed doorways. Doorways sealed on purpose. These are legends. Please, hold them as legends. But notice how the same legend keeps rising up in cultures that never met, separated by entire oceans and thousands of years of history, though. The same shape, rising out of the ground, in place after place after place. And then notice one more thing. This is the detail that changed how I saw all of it. The most famous face in this entire mystery. The face you draw when you close your eyes and imagine a visitor. The small gray body. The huge black wet eyes. A face with almost nothing on it at all, except two dark pools where the eyes should be. We assume that face comes from space, but there are texts. Old, mystical texts. Older than any telescope humanity ever built. And they describe beings who live inside the earth, with exactly that face. Gray-black eyes, and a nose that is nothing more than two dark holes. The face we thought we saw in the sky was written into the ground, long before we ever thought to look up. And that leads to a possibility that quietly turns this entire night on its head. What if the flying discs, the saucers, the lights, the craft that governments are nigh, so carefully beginning to film, what if they were never arriving from anywhere at all? Because people report something very strange about them, again and again, across decades, across continents. They watch a light in the sky begin to descend, toward the landscape, toward the horizon, and then it vanishes, into a hillside, into a lake, into the solid flank of a mountain, not crashing, not landing, entering. As though the sky was never their home to begin with, as though they were only ever going back down. And there's one final thread I have to give you before we let the story rest, because it explains something. It explains why, if any of this is true, you have probably never once been allowed to feel certain of it. There is a reason the pilots only ever whispered. A reason the diaries stay unverified. A reason the men in the forest were quietly kept away from the press. In 1953, a man named Albert Bender was, for a brief time, the most important UFO researcher in America. He ran an organization. He published a magazine that gathered sightings from all over the world. And in the great wave of sightings that swept the early 1950s, his work was everywhere. And then, after barely a single year, he shut it all down, suddenly, completely, and for a long time he refused to say why. What he eventually described, I give you as his account, and his account alone. He said he came home one night, he walked into his bedroom, and 3 figures came through the wall. Dark, shadowed, dressed in hats and long overcoats. Their eyes, he said, glowed faintly in the dark, and the room filled with a smell. Sharp, sulphurous, the smell of something burning. They did not speak out loud. He said the words simply arrived, fully formed, inside his mind, and the message was very simple. Stop. Stop your research. Stop your magazine. Stop looking. And afterward he was ill. He couldn't eat for days. He said the visits kept coming back, pressing on his mind, giving him headaches he couldn't explain. And in the end, he did exactly what they told him to do. He gave it all up. We call figures like that the men in black now. Pop culture turned them into agents in neat suits. A little bit funny, a little bit cool, easy to laugh at. But the people who claim to have actually met them don't describe agents at all. They describe something that doesn't quite know how to be human, that doesn't understand how to eat, or drink, or hold a simple everyday object, that appears out of nowhere shut down anyone who gets too close to the truth, and then vanishes again back into whatever dark it came from. Is it real? I cannot tell you that it is. It's testimony, one frightened man, and the others who came after him, over the years, telling the very same story. But if there truly is something here, something that does not want to be found, then a night like this one, you and me, in the quiet, following the trail down into the ground and back through time, this is exactly the kind of thing you would rather you never did, so maybe it's a good thing that we're only whispering. Let me pull the threads together now, gently. There's nothing left to be afraid of. It's almost time to sleep. We began this night by looking up at the stars and the endless cold black between them, so certain that if we were not alone, the answer had to be out there, far away, beyond our reach. And then, one thread at a time, the story turned us around. Governments that swore for 70 years the sky was empty, and then, quietly, built teams to study it, and agreed in secret meetings to share what they had seen. An admiral, real, who truly flew to the bottom of the world, and a diary, unproven, that claims he found a warm and living land beneath the ice, and a voice down there that was afraid of our bombs. Officers, alone in the dark, watching their most terrible weapons go cold and silent beneath a hovering light. Two airmen in a misty English forest who touched something they could never explain, who carried radiation and strange dreams out of those trees with them, and who came to believe, in the end, that the visitors weren't from another star at all, but from our own distant future. Us. Reaching back through time to fix something we haven't yet broken. A real Kiev in Vietnam, older than mankind, with its own hidden forest growing in the dark, and legends from opposite ends of the earth of something that lives beneath the ground, with a face we always thought belonged to the sky, and a man who was told, by figures that walked through his bedroom wall, to simply stop looking. I cannot tell you which of these is true. Some of it is documented, some of it is legend, some of it is one person's word, offered in good faith, that we will never be able to prove or disprove. But laid side by side, here in the dark, they all seem to point in the very same direction. Not up, not out, down, or inward, or backward through time itself, anywhere but the empty sky we've been searching all this while. So here's the question I'll leave you with, the one to carry down into sleep. For all our history, we have asked the same thing. Are we alone? But maybe that was never the frightening question. Maybe humanity has spent thousands of years searching the stars, building our telescopes, sending out our signals, straining to hear a voice from somewhere far away, while something beneath us has quietly watched every civilization rise and fall, and rise again, and waited. So sleep well tonight. Rest. And if you ever see a light drift down toward the horizon and disappear into the side of a mountain,